There's a profound and terrifying silence that settles into the walls of a home when the person you love for 40 years decides that your shared life is no longer enough for them. My name is Arthur. I am 67 years old, and I spent the first year of my retirement in Mexico trying to buy back the ghost of my marriage. I willingly handed my ex-wife $600,000 after she shattered our vows to join a local couple she had met, and now that she is suddenly begging to come home, I am forced to decide if forgiveness is a sign of wisdom or simply the exact same mistake, wearing a different mask. We had spent our entire adult lives in the United States grinding through the relentless machinery of corporate careers, mortgages, and societal expectations, always promising each other that our twilight years would be different. We chose Mexico because it represented an ultimate kind of freedom, a deliberate step away from the rigid, highly structured American way of life into a culture that prioritized warmth, community, and the simple beauty of living in the present moment. We bought a beautiful piece of property surrounded by agave fields, intending to spend our final decades embracing that slower pace, but I was completely blind to the fact that the sudden lack of American structure was slowly unraveling the woman I thought I knew. The betrayal did not happen overnight, but rather through a slow, agonizing drift that I was too naive to recognize until the damage was irreversible. Without the constant distractions of her former life, my wife began seeking out adrenaline and validation wherever she could find it, eventually crossing paths with a wealthy, deeply charismatic Mexican couple who owned an art gallery in the nearest city. At first, it was just late dinners and weekend excursions, which I encouraged, thinking she was simply absorbing the vibrant local culture we had relocated to enjoy. But the energy between them shifted into something exclusionary and intense, and she began spending days at a time at their estate, leaving me alone in the sanctuary we had painstakingly built together. When the truth finally surfaced, it was not a tearful confession, but a cold, matter-of-fact declaration that she was leaving me to become a permanent part of their arrangement. She looked at me with an absolute lack of empathy and explained that they offered her a level of passion and uninhibited freedom that our quiet, traditional 40-year marriage could never provide. Just like that, the foundation of my existence evaporated into the warm southern air, leaving me stranded in a foreign country with a broken heart and a terrifying void, where my future was supposed to be. The months following her departure plunged me into a suffocating, paralyzing loneliness that defied any logic or reason I tried to apply to it. Our divorce was expedited, and as we divided the assets we had spent a lifetime accumulating, a profound and entirely irrational sense of guilt began to consume me. I convinced myself that I had essentially ruined her life by moving her away from everything she knew, and that her drastic choices were a symptom of the isolation she felt in a new country. In a state of absolute emotional delirium, driven by a desperate, unspoken hope that an act of overwhelming generosity might pierce through her indifference, I instructed my attorney to transfer an additional $600,000 of my liquid retirement savings directly into her account. I told myself I was ensuring her safety and independence, but the brutal truth was that I was trying to purchase a permanent tether to her, terrified that if I completely severed our financial ties, she would vanish from the earth forever. I walked out of the bank that afternoon expecting to feel a great unburdening of my soul, but I only felt the hollow, sickening realization that I had just financed the new life she was building with the very people who had destroyed mine. It took 6 grueling months of absolute solitude for the fog of grief to finally begin lifting, allowing me to actually experience the freedom of the country I had moved to. I stopped waiting for the sound of tires in the driveway and started walking down into the local village, letting the genuine warmth of the Mexican people and the rich, unhurried rhythm of daily life slowly knit my sanity back together. I learned that true peace does not come from controlling the people around you, but from building a life that is entirely whole on its own, and I finally found the quiet contentment we had originally traveled south to discover. And then, exactly at the moment when the memory of her face lost its sharp, painful edge, my phone vibrated with a long, desperate message from a number I knew by heart. She wrote that the intoxicating lifestyle she had chased had turned out to be a cruel, empty illusion, that the couple had grown tired of her and moved on to someone else, and that the money I had given her was entirely gone. She said she was sitting in a cheap rented room, profoundly lost and terrified, and she wanted to know if we could talk about the possibility of her coming back home to the life we had planned. The immediate surge of validation was intoxicating, feeding a pathetic part of my ego that desperately wanted to be the ultimate victor in this terrible ordeal. But that initial rush quickly dissolved into a cold, piercing clarity. I realized that her desire to return was not born out of a sudden rediscovery of her love for me, but out of a frantic need for the safety, financial security, and unconditional shelter that I had always provided. I was not her great romance or her soulmate. I was simply her sanctuary of last resort, the backup plan she assumed would always be waiting with an open door and a forgiving smile. If I allowed her to cross that threshold, I would not be welcoming back a partner, but rather accepting the permanent role of a caretaker for a woman who only valued my devotion when the rest of the world had discarded her. Choosing to walk away from a 40-year history is a terrifying prospect, but preserving my own dignity and the fragile peace I have built in this beautiful country is worth far more than the comfort of a familiar pain. I am going to delete the message, pour myself a glass of tequila, and watch the sun set over the mountains, entirely alone, deeply at peace, and finally free. To truly understand how a 40-year marriage evaporates into thin air, you have to understand the sheer magnitude of the transition we made when we left the United States. For decades, our entire existence was defined by the relentless, invisible pressures of American life. We were running on a very expensive, never-ending treadmill, equating our worth with our productivity, our tax brackets, and the manicured appearance of our neighborhood. We had convinced ourselves that we were working toward a distant finish line, hoarding away our youth and our energy in exchange for a promised land of relaxation that always seemed just another 5 years away. When we finally decided to pull the trigger and move to Mexico, it felt like an absolute rebellion against everything we had been taught. We were not just relocating to a warmer climate. We were actively rejecting the sterile, hyper-regulated culture that had kept us perpetually exhausted. We wanted genuine freedom, the kind of freedom that allows you to wake up and let the day dictate its own rhythm, surrounded by a culture that values human connection over relentless commerce and hollow status symbols. I remember our first few months living in the state of Mexico feeling like a deep spiritual exhalation. The colors were brighter, the food was infinitely more vibrant, and there was a profound sense of liberty in the air, a stark contrast to the rigid societal expectations we had left behind up north. I threw myself entirely into this new chapter, with the eagerness of a man who had been holding his breath for a lifetime. I spent my mornings walking through the local markets, completely fascinated by the chaotic beauty of it all. I loved the lack of pretension, the way people would stop and genuinely ask about your day without looking over your shoulder to see if someone more important had entered the room. I felt a profound sense of liberation in Mexico, a deep appreciation for the way the culture embraced life and all its messy, wonderful reality. But freedom is a strange and highly volatile catalyst, and it affects different people in entirely different ways. While the lack of American structure allowed me to finally relax and find my center, it had the exact opposite effect on my wife. Without the familiar guardrails of our old life, without the neighborhood associations and the rigid social hierarchies that had steadily dictated our behavior for 40 years, she began to unravel. It started subtly, with a growing restlessness that she tried to mask as an enthusiastic exploration of her new surroundings. She had spent her entire adult life playing a specific role, acting as the pragmatic, organized anchor of our family. And without that stage to perform on, she found herself terrifyingly untethered. She began taking frequent trips into the more affluent, cosmopolitan areas of the city, drawn to a specific kind of bohemian expatriate and wealthy local crowd that I had absolutely zero interest in cultivating. That was how she met them. They were a stunningly charismatic Mexican couple, probably 15 years younger than us, who operated a high-end contemporary art gallery and seemed to possess an endless supply of wealth and energy. They represented a kind of sophisticated, dangerous glamour that was entirely alien to the quiet, domestic life we had built. They lived in a sprawling, historic estate, through lavish, uninhibited parties that stretched into the early hours of the morning and seemed to float entirely above the ordinary rules of conventional society. At first, I was genuinely happy that she had found a social outlet that excited her. I would stay home, reading on the terracotta patio we had designed together, enjoying the quiet evening air and the sound of the wind moving through the agave fields, while she dressed up and went into the city for gallery openings and late dinners. I trusted her implicitly, backed by the solid, unquestionable weight of 4 decades of shared history. I was entirely unaware that my willingness to let her explore was happily opening the door for her to walk entirely out of my life. The shift in her demeanor was insidious, a slow, daily poisoning of our interactions that I desperately wrote off as growing pains in a new environment. She started returning from these excursions with a strange, manic energy, speaking about this couple with a reverence that bordered on obsession. She began criticizing our home, calling our quiet life stagnant and predictable, directly comparing my contentment with the fiery, passionate existence her new friends supposedly led. The profound freedom of Mexico, which had brought me such incredible peace, had become a blank canvas for her to project her most reckless fantasies onto. She was intoxicating herself with their lifestyle, seduced by the thrill of being desired and included by people who lived without traditional boundaries. I began to notice the way she looked at me when she thought I was not paying attention. Her eyes filled with a cold, terrifying combination of pity and resentment. I had become an anchor holding her back from the thrilling, chaotic life she suddenly believed she was entitled to. There were evenings when I would sit across from her at the dinner table, listening to her talk endlessly about the gallery and the couple's lavish estate, and I would feel a cold dread settling in my stomach. I was listening to a stranger, the woman who had helped me budget for groceries in our 20s, the woman who had held my hand through the death of my parents, was systematically erasing our history to make room for an illusion. I was just too wrapped up in my own contentment, too blinded by the sunshine of my hard-earned retirement to see that the massive storm had already arrived and was quietly tearing the roof off our home. The actual fracture of a 4-decade marriage rarely resembles the dramatic, screaming arguments you see in films or read about in novels. For me, it happened on a remarkably beautiful Tuesday morning over a cup of locally roasted coffee on the patio we had designed together. She had returned from a 3-day excursion at their estate, carrying a leather overnight bag and an air of absolute terrifying finality. She did not unpack her things or offer any casual greeting about her weekend. Instead, she sat across from me, looked directly into my eyes with a chilling calmness, and dismantled my entire universe in a matter of minutes. She told me she was not just infatuated with the gallery owners, but that she had been intimately involved with both of them for months, and they had formally invited her to live with them as a permanent part of their romantic and financial arrangement. I sat there listening to the woman who had held my hand in the delivery room when our children were born, calmly explaining that our life together was essentially a completed chapter she was ready to close. She described their chaotic, uninhibited lifestyle as her true calling, painting our 40 years of loyalty and shared sacrifice as a suffocating prison she had finally escaped. There was no apology, no tearful hesitation, and absolutely no room for negotiation. She simply stated the new reality of her existence, picked up her bag, and walked out the door, leaving me sitting alone in the morning sun as the entire foundation of my life collapsed into dust. The immediate days following her departure were characterized by a profound and dangerous psychological shock. When you have spent your entire adult life defining yourself as a husband, a provider, and a partner, the sudden removal of that identity is an incredibly violent amputation. I would wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for a body that was no longer there, my hand brushing against the cold, empty cotton sheets before the crushing weight of reality settled back onto my chest. Our house, which had once felt like a vibrant sanctuary filled with light and potential, transformed overnight into a massive silent tomb. I stopped maintaining the property we had been so proud of. The beautiful garden we had planted began to wither under the intense Mexican sun, and I spent my days wandering from room to room like a ghost trapped in my own life. I was surrounded by the physical artifacts of a love that no longer existed. The books we had bought together, the pottery we had carefully selected from the local markets, the photographs of a shared history that now felt like an elaborate lie. The isolation was an absolute physical agony, a crushing pressure in my chest that made it difficult to draw a full breath. I was stranded thousands of miles away from the life I used to know, entirely unmoored and rapidly descending into a state of frantic, irrational desperation. The legal dissolution of our marriage moved with a ruthless, mechanical speed that entirely mocked the 40 years it took to build. She wanted the divorce finalized as quickly as possible so she could fully integrate into her new life, and I was far too broken to put up any kind of fight. We divided our assets with the cold efficiency of liquidating a failed business. The retirement accounts we had painstakingly built through decades of frugal living and sacrifice vacations were neatly cleaved in half. It was during this sterile, bureaucratic process that a deeply toxic and completely irrational narrative began to take root in my mind. I convinced myself that I was ultimately responsible for her departure. I told myself that I was the one who had uprooted her from the safety of the United States, that I had been too focused on my own desire for a quiet retirement to realize she was drowning in the transition. I watched her pull away, completely intoxicated by the wealth and glamour of this younger couple, and a pathetic, desperate part of me believed that if I could just provide for her on a massive scale, I could somehow tether her to me. I believed that if I gave her enough financial independence, she would eventually realize she did not need them, and the overwhelming magnitude of my generosity would shock her into remembering the depth of my devotion. This desperate delusion culminated in the single most destructive financial decision of my life. Against the frantic, repeated warnings of my attorney, who explicitly told me I was acting out of severe emotional trauma, I authorized an immediate voluntary transfer of $600,000 from my remaining liquid retirement funds directly into her personal account. It was a staggering amount of money, essentially the safety net I had secured for my own final decades, but in my broken state of mind, it did not feel like currency. It felt like a massive, undeniable declaration of my enduring love. I walked into a brightly lit bank in Naucalpan de Guares, a city that always hummed with a frantic, undeniable energy, and I signed the heavy stack of authorization forms with a trembling hand. The bank manager looked at me with a quiet, polite concern, clearly recognizing the hollow, exhausted look of a man making a terrible mistake. But he processed the paperwork without judgment. I watched the teller stamp the final document, effectively erasing half of my remaining security, and I waited for the profound sense of relief to wash over me. I waited for the feeling of nobility, the comfort of knowing I had done everything in my power to take care of the woman I loved. But as I stepped out of the air-conditioned bank and onto the sun-baked pavement of the busy street, I felt absolutely nothing. The chaotic noise of the city rushed over me, vendors calling up their prices, cars navigating the narrow streets, the vibrant pulse of Mexican life moving entirely indifferent to my suffering. There was no cinematic moment of emotional release. The money was gone, vanished into the digital ether, and my wife was still living on a sprawling estate with two people who were actively replacing me. I had not purchased her loyalty. I had not bought her forgiveness, and I certainly had not convinced her to return. I had simply liquidated a lifetime of my own hard work to finance the very betrayal that was destroying me. I stood on that crowded sidewalk, a 67-year-old man completely gutted by his own naive desperation, and realized with brutal clarity that you can never buy back a heart that has already decided to belong to someone else. I took a slow, agonizing breath, hailed a taxi to take me back to my empty house, and began the terrifying process of accepting that I was truly, irrevocably alone. The passage of time when you are truly, irrevocably alone moves with a strange and heavy viscosity that is entirely impossible to prepare for. The first few months after I walked out of that bank in Naucalpan and surrendered my life savings were defined by a profound, echoing silence that I had to force myself to endure every single day. I'd emptied my accounts and severed the final, desperate tether I had tied to the woman who used to be my wife, leaving myself completely unmoored in a foreign country. I woke up every morning in the house that suddenly felt cavernous and intimidating, making a pot of black coffee for one, and sitting on the patio watching the morning fog roll over the agave fields with a hollow ache in my chest that made drawing a full breath feel like a monumental physical task. When you spend 40 years anticipating someone else's needs, learning the exact rhythm of their footsteps, the subtle shifts in their moods, and the way they take their tea, the sudden and absolute absence of that person leaves a terrible, disorienting void. I had to consciously teach myself how to occupy space again, how to exist as a singular entity without the constant underlying hum of a partnership that had defined my entire adult life. I realized very quickly that if I remained locked inside the physical artifacts of my failed marriage, the isolation would eventually destroy me. I began forcing myself to leave the property, walking down into the local village, not as a grief-stricken tourist or a man trying to distract himself, but as a permanent resident seeking a genuine connection to the earth beneath my feet. Mexico has a remarkably beautiful way of grounding you if you are simply willing to let it. The culture here does not hide from grief or pretend that human suffering is an anomaly that needs to be swept under the rug and medicated away. I found a quiet, unspoken solidarity in the simple daily interactions at the open-air markets, the polite nods of acknowledgement from the local vendors who began to recognize the solitary older American man buying his modest portions of fruit and bread. I stopped trying to force the environment to adapt to my American sensibilities and simply surrendered to the unhurried, deeply human rhythm of the community around me. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the sharp, jagged edges of my trauma began to wear down into a dull, manageable ache. I started repairing the neglected parts of our home, not as a monument to her memory, but as a testament to my own survival. I spent weeks working outside, feeling the intense warmth of the sun on my shoulders as I cleared the overgrown garden, replaced the cracked terracotta tiles she had picked out, and repainted the walls that had absorbed so much of my despair. The physical labor was an incredible, unexpected remedy, pulling my chaotic focus away from the catastrophic failure of my marriage and grounding it entirely in the tangible reality of mortar, stone, and soil. I began reading extensively, sitting out on the patio late into the warm evenings with a single lamp burning, listening to the vast nocturnal symphony of the countryside. I realized that the crushing loneliness I had feared so intensely was actually a profound, terrifying opportunity for a complete reinvention. For the first time in my entire existence, I was entirely unburdened by the expectations of another human being. I did not have to compromise on how I spent my afternoons. I did not have to modulate my moods to keep the peace, and I did not have to perform the exhausting role of the steadfast, accommodating husband. I was simply a man learning to find genuine beauty in the absolute stillness of his own company. By the time 6 months had passed, I had achieved a level of genuine, quiet contentment that I sincerely believed was impossible when I first watched her walk out the door with her overnight bag. The memory of her leaving no longer sent a violent spike of panic through my nervous system, and the staggering financial loss I had suffered felt less like a tragedy and more like a necessary, expensive tuition paid for a master class in self-reliance. I had built a new life, a sturdy, solitary sanctuary that was entirely my own, and I finally understood the deep, abiding peace that had drawn us to Mexico in the first place. And then, precisely at the moment when I felt truly safe and completely healed, the past aggressively forced its way back into my present. I was sitting on the newly repaired patio on a remarkably beautiful Tuesday evening, watching the last golden light of the sun bleed into the horizon, when my phone vibrated sharply against the wrought iron table. I had deleted her contact information months ago in an act of self-preservation, but the digits that illuminated the screen were permanently burned into my memory. I stared at the glowing rectangle for what felt like an eternity, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs as 6 months of careful, agonizing healing was instantly thrown into absolute chaos. The message was incredibly long, pouring out onto the screen in a desperate, disjointed flood of apologies and horrific admissions. She wrote that the intoxicating, uninhibited lifestyle she had abandoned me for had been a complete and total illusion. The wealthy, charismatic gallery owners, the couple she had viewed as her ultimate salvation from her quiet life, had grown entirely bored of her the exact moment her novelty wore off. She confessed that they had systematically drained the $600,000 I had so foolishly given her, using my hard-earned retirement to fund their own lavish excursions before unceremoniously discarding her from their estate for someone younger and more vibrant. She wrote that she was currently sitting in a cheap, windowless rented room on the chaotic outskirts of the city, completely broke, profoundly humiliated, and absolutely terrified of the future she now faced alone. She begged me to remember the 4 decades we had shared, pleading for a chance to drive back to the house so we could simply talk about the possibility of her coming home. She said she finally realized what a catastrophic mistake she had made, that she had been blinded by a foolish fantasy, that I was the only person who had ever truly loved her, and that she desperately needed her husband. I read the words over and over again, the harsh blue light of the screen casting long shadows across the terracotta tiles, feeling the ghosts of my old life rising up from the floorboards to demand my attention. The woman who had shattered my universe was suddenly standing at the gate, completely broken, asking for the one thing I had sworn I would never give her again. Reading that message sent a highly intoxicating surge of vindication straight into my bloodstream. It is a terribly dark and pathetic part of the human ego that rejoices when the person who broke you is finally broken themselves. For a few frantic minutes, sitting there in the fading Mexican twilight, the fantasy I had prayed for during my darkest months was suddenly being offered to me on a silver platter. I could type a single word in reply. I could tell her to pack whatever she had left and drive back to the sanctuary we had built. The agonizing silence of the house would instantly be filled with the familiar sounds of her footsteps, the smell of her perfume, and the decades of shared habits that had defined my existence. I could play the role of the magnanimous savior, rescuing my wife from the wreckage of her own terrible decisions, and we could simply pretend that this horrific detour had never happened. The gravitational pull of that familiar comfort was incredibly powerful, dragging me back toward the edge of a cliff I had spent 6 months crawling away from. But as the initial rush of adrenaline began to subside, leaving me sitting in the quiet evening air, a cold and piercing clarity washed over me. I looked down at the glowing screen and realized that her desperate plea had absolutely nothing to do with a sudden rediscovery of her love for me. She did not miss the man sitting on this patio. She missed the absolute, unconditional safety that I had always provided. The wealthy gallery owners had offered her passion and uninhibited freedom, but they had fundamentally lacked the steadfast, boring reliability that she had taken for granted for 4 decades. She was not returning because I was her great, undeniable romance. She was returning because I was her sanctuary of last resort. I was the incredibly well-funded backup plan that she assumed would always be waiting with an open door and a forgiving smile. The $600,000 I had sacrificed in a state of naive desperation had not bought her loyalty. It had simply subsidized her betrayal until the funds ran dry. If I allowed her to cross that threshold again, I would not be welcoming back an equal partner. I would be accepting the permanent, humiliating role of a caretaker for a woman who only valued my devotion when the rest of the world had completely discarded her. The man who had walked into that bank in Nakapan 6 months ago, trembling and desperate to purchase a sliver of relevance in his own marriage, simply did not exist anymore. That man had been terrified of the silence. He had believed that his entire worth was tied to his ability to provide for a woman who was actively abandoning him. The man sitting on the terracotta tiles tonight had walked through the absolute fire of complete isolation and discovered that he could not only survive on his own, but that he could actually thrive. I had built a profound and unshakable peace in this beautiful country, learning to draw strength from the earth, the community, and the quiet rhythm of my own independent life. Forgiveness is a beautiful and entirely necessary concept, and I do forgive her for the immense pain she caused, because holding on to that toxic anger is essentially drinking poison and expecting the other person to perish. But true forgiveness does not require a surrender of your own self-respect. It does not demand that you reopen the door to someone who has clearly demonstrated a willingness to completely destroy your peace for their own amusement. There comes a definitive point in your life when you must look at your own reflection and decide that your dignity is worth significantly more than the comfort of a familiar pain. We are conditioned to believe that true love requires endless, agonizing endurance, that we must weather every single storm and turn the other cheek no matter how deeply we are struck by the people we trust. But I am here to tell you that there is absolutely no virtue in allowing yourself to be consumed by someone else's chaos. If you are ever faced with the prospect of buying back a person who willingly chose to leave you, I sincerely hope you have the courage to keep your wealth, protect your heart, and walk away. The empty house might feel utterly terrifying at first, and the silence might ring in your ears like a physical blow, but in time, that profound absence transforms into a beautiful, unshakable peace. You simply cannot heal by returning to the exact environment where you were broken, and you cannot find genuine, lasting companionship with someone who only seeks your shelter when it begins to rain. I looked at the long, desperate block of text illuminating my phone one last time, feeling a profound wave of sadness for the woman I had loved for 40 years, but feeling absolutely no desire to save her. I pressed my thumb against the screen, permanently deleting the message and blocking the number, effectively severing the final thread that connected us. I set the phone face down on the wrought iron table, poured myself a generous measure of tequila, and leaned back in my chair. The warm Mexican night was settling over the agave fields. The stars were beginning to pierce through the fading twilight, and the house behind me was entirely silent. It was a silence that no longer terrified me, but rather wrapped around my shoulders like a heavy, comforting blanket. I took a slow, deep breath of the evening air, entirely alone, deeply at peace, and for the very first time in my 67 years of life, completely and unapologetically free.